Trade talks continue to escalate around the Pittsburgh Penguins, with an NHL insider linking them to a Western Conference team to be the perfect trade candidate. And there's a recently acquired Pittsburgh Penguin that's changing everything for the team. We're going to break all this down and more later on this episode. Before we start, I just want to give a huge shout out to everyone watching this video. If you want to go down and leave a comment where you're watching from, how you became a Pittsburgh Penguins fan or a fan of whatever team you're watching, make sure to go down and leave that in the comments. But with that, let's just hop straight into the first topic today, Darius, which is the Pittsburgh Penguins are once again in more trade rumors. Now, these trade rumors come from NHL insider Kevin Weekes talking about the Canucks forward Nils Hoglander. Now, with Hoglander, he's 24 years old. He's on a $1.1 million cap hit, and he does have an extension kicking in next year, which is $3 million at 3 years. This is a skilled forward, and the teams interested in on him are the Washington Capitals, the Pittsburgh Penguins, and the Columbus Blue Jackets. But of course, we're going to talk about the most important team out of these three, which is the Pittsburgh Penguins. Now, looking at Hoglander, a lot of fans from the Pittsburgh Penguins might not know who this is. He's a young forward. He's a winger. He's only 23 years old, a former second-round pick by the Canucks in 2019. He came off last year with 24 goals, 12 assists for 36 points. The biggest thing with this player, Darius, is a lot of people might look and say, hey, 24 goals does seem pretty cool. And the biggest thing with Hoglander, he scored a majority of these playing in the bottom six before being promoted into the top six for the Canucks. Do you think this is something that Kyle Dubas might look at when he continues to make this team younger while still trying to compete?
Well, first of all, I think it's pretty interesting that Kevin Weekes didn't report this from some random place like he normally does on Twitter. But nonetheless, the Pittsburgh Penguins should absolutely be all in on this player if he is available, if the Canucks are shopping him, because this is a player who can really help the lineup offensively, I think, with a change of scenery. Because again, like you mentioned, he's been playing in the bottom six. For his skill set and for him to continue to thrive in the NHL, I think he has to play top 6 minutes. And maybe on a little bit of a worse team. And let's not kid ourselves, the Pittsburgh Penguins are not great that year, and they could use a guy like a little project like this. And we'll get to another player who is a bit of a project player as well later in the video, but they could use a guy like this in the top six. I think he could certainly help. And the Penguins have to get younger. That's the other thing we've been talking about as well. You would do that getting a player like this into your lineup. He's only 23 years old. Again, second round pick just a couple of years ago. So I think he can definitely help the lineup. And the Penguins right now are very quietly, I think Kyle Dubas is very quietly retooling on the fly. He's getting some young players that haven't been performing well for other teams who are still young and have a high ceiling and high potential, and inserting them into the lineup and seeing what they can do this season, because he's having a tough time trading the big dogs right now. So I think this is a player, if available, I think the Penguins should absolutely go after. And Mark, I know that the Canucks, they have some needs right now, and I think that the Penguins could probably help them out with that as well.
And I mean, looking at Hoglander, before we get into a possible trade, like I said, his contract does kick in next year. He is 23 years old, so you get this guy going into his prime. A bit of a project, but a lot of people might look at Hoglander and say, hey, why would we want him if he's not playing well with the Canucks? But the biggest thing is their top six, their middle six, has kind of filled out, and Rick Tocchet has kind of lost a bit of trust where he's not playing the system. I think a change of scenery would help a lot, and filling him in maybe on O'Connor's spot on the second line could add a lot of value to this team. But looking at what it's going to cost, and there is a big need with the Vancouver Canucks, and that is a defenseman, as they're down quite a few players. JT Miller's out, Thatcher Demko's out, but now Hronek has been out with an injury, and it's undetermined how long he'll be out. So it does seem like a trade for Marcus Pettersson would make the most sense. It'd be quite funny because this would be the third Pettersson on the Vancouver Canucks. It's almost like finishing the Affinity Gauntlet. But looking at Pettersson, a guy that can come into this lineup, and yes, I know Penguins fans like this guy, and a lot of Penguins fans might not like this guy as well, but with the needs of the Canucks needing to fill out the spot, Darius, looking at maybe a 1-for-1 swap, do you think this would make sense for both teams?
It makes sense for both teams and what they need, but I think if you're the Pittsburgh Penguins, you can get a lot more for Marcus Pettersson around the league right now, not necessarily with the Canucks, but the Canucks have a need, so maybe they can work out a deal. I think there's got to be some more draft picks in there as well. But on the other side for the Canucks, I think it's time. I think it's a change of scenery would benefit Hoglander for sure. And I think, moving to Pittsburgh, he's going to get a really good opportunity if he were to be traded to Pittsburgh to play with some really high-end talent, because, the wings in Pittsburgh aren't exactly, full of skill right now. So I think that it's a good move in that way. But I do think, if you're the Penguins, you need a little bit more from Marcus Pettersson, because if you look around the league, he's a hot commodity right now. His name's coming up in a lot of trade chatter. And I think the Penguins are going to have to move off of him this year. I think that is going to happen before the trade deadline.
And we've seen the Columbus Blue Jackets kind of set just the tone of what a defenseman's going to cost. Yes, Juracek was a young defenseman that could bloom into a star player any day. But Marcus Pettersson's a veteran, a guy that could fit in a lot of teams, especially on the defensive core. We see Pettersson putting up good points each season. He's not playing on the top power play, but he does play the top penalty kill. He's fit in perfectly with an offensive defenseman in Erik Karlsson. This is going to be a player that's going to be flying around the rumors constantly. And like you said, it does seem like Hoglander might not be enough, but when you do look at the Canucks capital, they still do have a bit to move. They have a first round pick in the next 3 drafts, 2 seconds, 1/3. They have a lot of 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th round picks, and by a lot I mean they've only moved one of them. So looking at with what the Canucks have, if they want this retained, and the Canucks could probably squeeze this not retained, but if they do want to work a trade out for a guy like Pettersson, it would be draft capital, maybe a prospect. The Canucks have a ton of prospects. I mean, Melvin Fernstrom was drafted in the 3rd round this year. He's playing great for Åbro in the Swedish Hockey League. You have someone like Elias Pettersson, who's not going to be the Elias Pettersson on the roster. They actually have 2, and everyone calls him DPD as he's a defenseman, is another interesting piece. And Tom Willander, who does seem like their top prospect, next to Jonathan Lekkerimaki. So they do have a lot of potential. But Darius, if the Canucks reached out and said, hey, we'll throw you a 2nd round pick, maybe a mid to late a pick as well, along with Hoglander, do you think that's enough to get it done at this very moment?
I think it could be, because obviously I think the Penguins would want like a first round pick for Marcus Pettersson at this point in time, because I think it fills a need of a lot of teams around the league. But if you're able to get another project player that could absolutely help your team, and I do think that he could help the Pittsburgh Penguins, and a 2nd round pick, that's a pretty good haul from Marcus Pettersson, a guy that you probably know isn't going to be re-signed in Pittsburgh. So I think that they could do something like that. Again, it's filling a need for the Penguins. They need some scoring as well. They can't score. They can't defend. They have no goaltending right now. So try to slowly retool on the fly as best as they can and get a guy like this, who again is a project player. And we're going to get into another one in a minute, but I think it could help the Pittsburgh Penguins. So it's definitely something that they would look at. And I think that's something that, Kyle Dubas might be okay with.
And I mean, looking at the president of hockey ops for the Vancouver Canucks is Jim Rutherford, who was the former GM. So we know he has ties with the Pittsburgh Penguins. We know Trader Jim loves to make moves during the season, and he's not afraid to make a shakeup. So it will get quite interesting. But Darius, I'll kind of throw it to you. There is another player you wanted to talk about.
Yes, and with the Pittsburgh Penguins, they just acquired just a couple days ago Philip Tomasino from the Nashville Predators. This is a player who was drafted quite high. When you watched him in the OHL, and I watched him for quite a while in the OHL, especially with the Niagara Ice Dogs, and of course, 1 season with the Oshawa Generals when he was acquired for a little bit of a run there. He had a very high ceiling. This is a player where you're like, okay, it's going to translate to the NHL. He's going to have a really good NHL career. The skill and all of that has followed him to the AHL level. We can see that he's put up pretty good numbers in a limited amount of time in the AHL, but it has not followed him thus far to the NHL, at least not consistently, right? You can see it flashes in his game that, yes, maybe it has followed him, but so far consistently it has not. So he is a guy that I think, the Pittsburgh Penguins, it's changed a lot for them in acquiring this player. We talk a lot about project players, and Kyle Dubas loves those types of players, and we saw it in Toronto as well, just picking players who aren't performing well and seeing what they can do and bring them in and kind of reevaluate them. And he's doing exactly that with Phil Tomasino, and I think he's going to have a great time in Pittsburgh. He already has 2 points, 2 goals in 3 games since he's got there. Pittsburgh Penguins fans seem to love this player so far, and I think he has a very high ceiling still. He's a little bit older. I wouldn't consider him a prospect anymore by any means, but I think he's a guy who can definitely help the team and still has a lot of promise, I think. I think he was kind of bounced around in Nashville's organization as well, and I think he's going to get a real shot to play with some really good talent in Pittsburgh.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the immediate impact, he's been great playing alongside of Evgeny Malkin. The biggest thing, like you said, Kyle Dubas loves these project players. We've seen Michael Bunting in Toronto. He followed him all the way to Pittsburgh after Dubas joined this team as the general manager. He likes to buy low with the low risk, high reward players, and it seems to have really paid off. So maybe Hoglander's the next project that he wants to pick up that could be Blossom. And listen, I've watched a lot of Canucks games. I am partly a Canucks fan. Hoglander is a guy that can score 30 goals. He doesn't fit the Canucks system, but I do genuinely think whatever team gets him is going to get a steal in a player. I'm not going to say he's going to go out and win the Rocket, but he's going to produce on whatever team he gets to. But guys, guys' thoughts on this. What's your thoughts on them possibly acquiring Hoglander? What would you like to give up in a trade for Hoglander? I know a lot of you are going to say a 7th round pick, but let's be realistic here. And what's your thoughts on the moves Dubas has been doing? What would you like to see him continue doing? Let us know down in the comments. But I've been your host, Mark, with my co-host Darius, and take care.